In September of 1944, following a successful summer campaign across France, American forces on the Western Front harbored a firm belief that the war would conclude by Christmas. However, as they approached the Siegfried Line, a formidable defensive fortification at Germany's border, Anglo-American armies encountered fierce German resistance, compelling them to halt their advance. Compounding these difficulties, Allied supply lines became excessively stretched, leading to a critical logistical crisis by mid-September. On the path of the American forces, under the command of General Omar Bradley, lay the Hürtgen Forest, a vast expanse by European standards situated on the frontier between Belgium and Germany. The mission for the American troops in this sector was to tie down German forces within the Hürtgen, preventing their redeployment northward towards the Ardennes. There, Allied forces were struggling to breach the Siegfried Line. Furthermore, the forest offered a direct route to the Roer River. By opening the dams on the river, the Germans could flood the Roer Valley, thereby halting the American advance while preserving their own reserves. Meanwhile, for the Germans, the dense terrain of the Hürtgen Forest proved to be a significant advantage. Numerous landmines, well-placed firing positions, and bunkers situated on the hills presented a substantial obstacle to the American infantry. However, the primary strength of the defense lay in artillery. Controlling the high ground afforded the Germans excellent observation, and artillery spotters relayed precise coordinates to numerous batteries positioned on the west bank of the Rhine River. Field Marshal Model intended to stubbornly defend the positions in the Hürtgen Forest, recognizing its strategic importance as a focal point for the American Army. Lieutenant General Courtney Hodges initiated engagements for the Hürtgen Forest. The 3rd Armored Division of the U.S. Army was the first to enter the woods. Within the initial days, a significant portion of their armored vehicles became bogged down in mud or detonated on mines. The Germans systematically destroyed American tanks, and from this point onward, tanks on both sides played only a supporting role, with the main struggle unfolding between infantry and artillery. Replacing the stalled 3rd Armored Division, elements of the 9th Infantry Division moved in. Concurrently, the Germans began a hasty reinforcement of the forest with additional units. Field Marshal Model fully understood that the Hürtgen Forest was an ideal location to impede the American advance into western Germany. Within the dense woodland, the effectiveness of artillery and armor was considerably diminished. Moreover, the Allies could not fully leverage their air superiority. During the September battles, the 3rd Armored and 9th Infantry Divisions suffered losses of up to 80% of their personnel without achieving any significant objectives. Continuing their offensive, by October 16th, the American 9th Division had advanced only 3 kilometers, sustaining 4,500 casualties, killed, wounded, and missing. A major strategic error by elements of the 1st Army, specifically the 5th Corps under Major General Leonard Jarrow, was the tactic of committing 1 or 2 divisions sequentially into battle, rather than concentrating substantial forces on a single axis to break through German resistance. The Americans attempted to fulfill their original objective at all costs, employing limited forces. Among the thousands of Americans involved in these combat operations was the writer Jerome Salinger, serving with the 12th Infantry Division, which lost approximately 2,500 soldiers in the forest. The hardships Salinger encountered profoundly influenced his subsequent literary works. Meanwhile, on November 2nd, 1944, the 84th Infantry Division was thrown into the meat grinder. The division's commander, Norman Cota, was determined to capture the village of Schmidt deep within the forest, which the 9th Division had previously assaulted unsuccessfully. This decision would ultimately cost the lives of thousands of his soldiers. Initially, the advancing troops came under bombardment from their own aircraft. 2 days later, after occupying Schmidt, they were subjected to a German armored counterattack, resulting in a mass rout. This proved catastrophic for the 28th Division, which lost half its strength, and for General Cota personally. Someone had to be held accountable for the ignominious retreat, and the most infamous became Eddie Slovik, the only American executed during World War II for desertion. Despite the fact that all infantry company officers in the advancing American units in the forest were either killed or wounded, General Bradley persisted in his insistence on capturing the Hürtgen Forest. To this end, the 79th Infantry Division was deployed, but this also failed to yield the desired results. From November 7th to December 3rd, 1944, the division suffered over 7,000 casualties. One of the commanding officers, Lieutenant Wilson, reported to headquarters, "We started with," which was soon replaced by one of the most elite divisions in the entire American Army, the 1st Infantry Division. German units defending the Siegfried line were led by experienced commanders who possessed extensive combat experience on the Eastern Front, enabling them to effectively counter the advancing American divisions. On November 16th, the American command initiated Operation Queen with the objective of reaching the Roer River and establishing a bridgehead for further advances towards the Rhine. 4 divisions of the 7th Corps, under Major General Joseph Collins, attempted to breach the German positions in the forest, but as before, they met tenacious German resistance, incurred heavy losses, and were forced to halt. Seeking to alter the situation, elements of the U.S. 5th Corps were committed to the fight. By the end of November, the 28th Infantry Division managed to break through to the town of Kleinhau. One of the primary objectives for the Americans in this sector was Hill 400, also known as Castle Hill. From this vantage point, there was a clear view of the Roer River and the entire Hürtgen Forest. The Germans had constructed several bunkers and dug extensive trenches on the hill. Before assaulting the hill, the Americans needed to secure the surrounding settlements. By early December, after intense fighting, the Americans captured the villages of Fosses, Brandenburg, and Bergstein. In turn, the Germans retreated to the western slopes of Hill 400 and launched several counterattacks, which the Americans successfully repelled. In these engagements, the Americans extensively utilized heavy artillery, including 8-inch howitzers and bulldozers fashioned from tanks to fill in trenches and overcome obstacles. Having secured Bergstein, the American infantrymen created conditions for the assault on Hill 400. For the decisive push, General Bradley reinforced the attacking units with the 2nd Battalion of Rangers, who had previously distinguished themselves in the assault on the Normandy beaches. With artillery support, they managed to capture the hill, repelling numerous German counterattacks. By the end of the day, out of 2 assault companies of Rangers, only 25 men remained standing. Just 9 days later, the Germans recaptured Castle Hill. The fighting in the Hürtgen Forest was so ferocious that advances were measured in meters. Here, the Americans faced brutal positional warfare, reminiscent of the battles their ancestors had endured during the First World War. The renowned writer and war correspondent Ernest Hemingway famously dubbed the Hürtgen a Passchendaele with trees, referencing one of the most infamous battles of that war. In mid-December, the Battle of the Hürtgen Forest concluded with a tactical victory for the Wehrmacht. The Americans failed to capture the forest mass and reach the Roer River. The result of 3 months of fighting was devastating losses on both sides. Americans suffered over 33,000 casualties, killed and wounded, while the Germans lost over 28,000 soldiers and officers. A new American offensive in the Hürtgen Forest did not commence until February of 1945, following the German counteroffensive in the Ardennes. By this time, the German forces defending the Siegfried line were essentially annihilated. The Germans began to surrender in large numbers, recognizing the futility of further defense. On February 10th, elements of the U.S. First Army took control of the dams on the Roer River. However, by then, the Germans had already managed to open the floodgates, causing the river valley to inundate. The American advance towards the Rhine could only begin in the latter half of February because of the resulting flooding. The Army command made every effort to minimize any information about it. Patriotically inclined journalists deliberately omitted these events from news reports and newspaper articles. American families were informed that their husbands, fathers, brothers, and sons had perished in Central Europe, but the forests were rarely mentioned in casualty reports. Furthermore, information about the heavy losses was suppressed to avoid influencing the election campaign of future President Eisenhower, who commanded Allied forces during the war. Decades after the war's conclusion, American historians offer a critical assessment of the actions of General Bradley and his subordinate, Courtney Hodges. Instead of outflanking the forest and advancing along the valley, American divisions charged directly through the heavily mined woods, forfeiting air and armored support. By advancing deep into the dense forest, American units could not establish a continuous defensive line, allowing the Germans to frequently infiltrate their positions. The Germans, dug into bunkers and dugouts, had a significant advantage over the Americans, who huddled in hastily constructed trenches. Additionally, the Americans faced problems with winter acclimatization and pneumonia, which sharply increased non-combat losses. A participant in those battles, Lieutenant Ulfberg, recalled, "Some of us, with combat experience from the beaches of Normandy to the Rhine, struggled to comprehend the senselessness of this fight in these conditions." Instead of simply bypassing the forest to the flank, German historians refer to this battle as a miracle on the West Wall. However, this miracle would hardly have occurred without the miscalculations of American command, which, after its victories in Normandy, underestimated the German strength and anticipated a swift success. The Battle of the Hürtgen Forest is still considered the longest engagement the American Army has ever faced. Yet, it was overshadowed by concurrent operations such as Market Garden and the Battle of the Bulge. The battle also found its way into cinema. In 1988, the film When the Trumpets Fall Silent, directed by John Irvin, was released. This is one of the few American war films that depict combat operations with relative realism, devoid of Hollywood sensationalism and the falsehood that the Allies single-handedly won World War II.